Here's the truth most people miss. Toxic people are predictable. They thrive on reaction, access, and chaos. They lose power when faced with structure, patience, and silence. This isn't about being cold or arrogant. It's about being unavailable to manipulation. If you want focus, ambition, and a future bigger than your current environment, you must understand why people test you and how to pass those tests without losing energy, time, or direction. Let's break this down into 5 core principles, not advice, principles. Toxic people don't test you because you lack strength. They test you because they sense unused strength that hasn't been defended yet. That distinction matters. Weakness repels most people. Unguarded potential attracts exploitation. When someone sees discipline forming but not fully claimed, ambition growing but not yet protected, generosity offered without structure, they don't see kindness. They see access. And access, when it's cheap, gets used without respect. This is not a moral judgment. It's a behavioral pattern repeated quietly across families, workplaces, friendships, and entire communities. Most people misunderstand why they're being tested. They assume conflict means hostility, or that repeated disrespect means someone is cruel by nature. In reality, most toxic behavior is opportunistic, not malicious. It's driven by observation. People watch how you respond to small things long before they attempt bigger ones. They notice whether you hesitate to say no. They notice whether you explain yourself when you don't need to. They notice whether your generosity has conditions or whether it leaks endlessly. Every one of those moments sends a signal, and signals compound. Consider the everyday example of someone who is reliable and capable at work. They show up early, solve problems quietly, don't complain. At first, they're appreciated. Then slowly, without any announcement, extra responsibility appears. Tasks that aren't theirs. Deadlines that weren't agreed upon, expectations that were never negotiated. When they comply without resistance, the behavior escalates. Not because others hate them, but because systems move toward least resistance. The person with potential but no boundary becomes the default solution. Over time, their energy drains, their focus fractures, and their growth stalls. The original strength that attracted attention becomes the very thing that's consumed. This dynamic exists in personal relationships too. Someone who listens deeply, forgives quickly, and gives without keeping score often believes they're building harmony. What they're actually doing, if they're not careful, is teaching others that emotional labor is free. The moment they ask for reciprocity, they're surprised by pushback. You've never had a problem before, they're told. That statement reveals everything. The problem existed the whole time. It just wasn't defended. Boundaries are not walls built out of fear. They're pricing mechanisms. They signal cost, and cost determines behavior more than intention ever will. When something costs nothing, it's consumed without thought. When it costs clarity, effort, or accountability, it's treated with care. Toxic people test boundaries because they're looking for the true cost of access. If the price is unclear, they'll keep sampling until they find it. This is where misplaced thinking quietly damages outcomes. Many people believe boundaries are confrontational, that enforcing them will damage relationships or make them seem difficult. So they delay. They tolerate small violations, telling themselves it's not worth the trouble. But every delay is a trade-off. You trade short-term comfort for long-term erosion. You trade momentary peace for sustained distraction. Over time, the mental load of unspoken resentment becomes heavier than the discomfort of a clear boundary ever would have been. The cost shows up subtly. Focus declines first. You find it harder to concentrate on meaningful work because part of your attention is occupied by managing people's expectations. Discipline weakens because your schedule is no longer fully yours. Ambition becomes diluted, not because your goals change, but because your energy is divided. Opportunity cost begins to accumulate quietly. Every hour spent accommodating someone who drained you is an hour not invested in something that compounds. Toxic people don't create this outcome alone. The environment that allows it is co-created. When boundaries are vague, behavior fills the gap. This is not about blame, it's about responsibility. Responsibility means recognizing that how you manage access teaches others how to treat you, not through words, but through patterns. Patterns are more persuasive than explanations. There's an uncomfortable truth here. Being tested often means you've been inconsistent with yourself. You know internally when something crosses a line. The hesitation comes afterward. You question whether you're being too sensitive, too rigid, too demanding. That internal negotiation delays action. From the outside, that delay looks like permission. Human behavior responds to what is enforced, not what is felt. Long-term thinkers understand this early. They don't wait for resentment to accumulate before acting. They set expectations while emotions are still neutral. They understand that boundaries established calmly are easier to maintain than boundaries enforced emotionally. When you wait till you're exhausted or angry, enforcement feels dramatic. When you act early, it feels natural. This doesn't require aggression or explanation. In fact, the most effective boundaries are often quiet. A delayed response, a declined request without justification, a change in availability. These small adjustments communicate structure, and structure changes behavior faster than confrontation ever will. There's also sacrifice involved. Some people will leave when access changes. That loss feels personal at first, but it reveals alignment. Relationships that depend on unlimited access are fragile by design. They're not built to survive growth. When you raise your standards, not everyone can or wants to rise with you. Letting that happen is part of discipline. You sacrifice familiarity to protect trajectory. The deeper insight is this: potential is not respected until it's defended. Talent without boundaries invites consumption. Vision without structure attracts noise. Discipline without enforcement turns into burnout. This is not pessimism, it's realism. Systems behave according to incentives. People do too. When you begin to protect your time, energy, and attention consistently, something interesting happens. The testing decreases. Not because people suddenly become better, but because the cost is now clear. Those who remain adjust. Those who don't fade. Either outcome is information. And information, when acted upon, sharpens decision-making. The goal isn't to harden yourself, it's to clarify yourself. Clear standards reduce conflict, preserve focus, and protect long-term outcomes. They allow generosity to be intentional rather than draining. They allow ambition to compound rather than scatter. They allow discipline to serve growth instead of recovery. Every choice carries a trade-off. You can choose short-term comfort and absorb long-term erosion, or you can choose short-term discomfort and protect long-term direction. Toxic people will always test where clarity is missing. The moment clarity arrives, the test ends, not with drama, but with distance, adjustment, or silence. And that silence is often the sound of focus returning. Toxic people rely on emotion the way a careless gambler relies on luck. Not because it's stable, but because it's effective in the short term. Emotion shortens time horizons. It compresses thinking. It pushes decisions out of the future and into the moment. And when decisions live only in the moment, strategy disappears. This is why provocation is such a common tool, not to win an argument, but to collapse your ability to think clearly long enough for them to gain leverage. Most people believe emotional reactions are spontaneous and uncontrollable. That belief is convenient, but it's not accurate. Emotions are real, but the way we respond to them is learned. Over time, patterns form. Someone criticizes you, and your body reacts before your mind has a chance to intervene. Your tone changes, your focus narrows. You feel an urge to correct, defend, or strike back. In that moment, you are no longer choosing, you are reacting. A reaction is predictable. Predictability is power in the hands of someone who wants to manipulate an outcome. Consider how often conflicts escalate not because the issue is large, but because timing is wrong. A comment made when you're tired, a message read without context, a demand placed when your mental bandwidth is already low. These are not accidents. People who thrive on chaos instinctively sense vulnerability. They press when your defenses are down, not because they planned it analytically, but because behavior teaches them what works. When they see that emotional pressure produces immediate compliance or visible distress, the behavior repeats. Cause leads to effect, and the cycle tightens. The cost of emotional reaction is rarely paid immediately. In the moment, reacting can feel relieving. You say what you've been holding back. You defend your position. You feel briefly justified. But relief is not resolution. The long-term cost arrives later, quietly. Relationships become tense. Reputations shift. Focus breaks, opportunities narrow. Emotional decisions often feel powerful in the short term and expensive in the long term. There's a reason disciplined environments value composure. It's not about suppressing feeling, it's about preserving judgment. When emotions run high, the brain prioritizes threat over reasoning. Attention narrows to winning the exchange rather than protecting the outcome. In practical terms, this means you might win an argument and lose leverage. You might express yourself fully and sacrifice future positioning. The trade-off is rarely worth it, but emotion hides that calculation in the moment. Toxic people understand this instinctively. They don't need to articulate it. They provoke, because provocation reveals who is thinking and who is reacting. The person who reacts emotionally becomes easy to steer. A raised voice signals insecurity. Over-explaining signals doubt. Anger signals attachment. Each signal offers information, and information once gathered is used. Think about everyday situations. A colleague questions your competence in front of others. The emotional urge is to defend immediately, to restore status. If you do, you've accepted the frame they set. You're now playing on their terms, in public, under pressure. A calm response, or even no response at all, feels unsatisfying in the moment, but it preserves something more valuable: control over timing and context. Later, in a private setting, facts can be addressed without theater, or they may not need to be addressed at all, because your consistent performance speaks louder than any defense. The same dynamic appears in personal relationships. Someone pushes your buttons, not with overt hostility, but with subtle digs, sarcasm, or guilt. When you react emotionally, the focus shifts from the behavior to your reaction. Now you're explaining your tone instead of their actions. The original issue disappears. This is not accidental. It's a redirection. Emotional reactions make it easier for others to avoid accountability. Long-term thinkers train themselves to pause, not because they lack feeling, but because they understand cost. They know that every emotional response has an opportunity cost attached. Time spent in reactive conversations is time not spent building something durable. Mental energy spent replaying arguments is energy not invested in planning, learning, or execution. Over months and years, these small drains accumulate into significant losses. This is where discipline becomes practical rather than abstract. Discipline is not just waking up early or working long hours. It's regulating your responses so that your future self isn't sabotaged by your present mood. It's choosing not to respond when responding offers no strategic advantage. It's understanding that silence is not surrender. It's often a repositioning. There's also sacrifice involved. Emotional restraint can feel like swallowing pride. It can feel like letting something go unanswered. That discomfort is the price of clarity. Many people avoid this price and instead pay a much higher one later in the form of stress, damaged relationships, or stalled progress. The choice is not between comfort and discomfort. It's between short-term discomfort and long-term regret. Over time, patterns emerge. When you consistently refuse to engage emotionally, people adjust. Some lose interest. Some escalate briefly, hoping to trigger a response. Others adapt and interact more respectfully. In each case, your behavior reshapes the environment, not through force, but through consistency. Emotional neutrality removes the reward that toxic behavior depends on. This doesn't mean becoming cold or detached from life. It means being selective about where emotion is invested. Emotion is a powerful resource. When directed toward meaningful goals, relationships that reciprocate, and work that compounds, it fuels resilience and creativity. When wasted on provocation, it becomes a liability. The uncomfortable truth is that many people confuse emotional expression with authenticity. They believe that if they don't react, they're being dishonest. In reality, restraint can be a deeper form of honesty about priorities. Not every feeling deserves a stage. Not every provocation deserves a response. Choosing where to place your emotional energy is an act of self-respect. Over a long enough timeline, this approach changes outcomes. You become harder to manipulate, not because you're defensive, but because you're deliberate. Your decisions slow down. Your thinking lengthens. You begin to see patterns instead of incidents. And once you see patterns, you stop taking behavior personally and start responding strategically. The result is not emotional numbness, but emotional efficiency. You feel what you feel, but you don't let it drive the wheel. That distinction separates people who stay busy reacting from those who quietly build something lasting, while others argue about the moment. Toxic people push limits not because they're curious, but because they're searching for a weakness they can rely on. That weakness is rarely a lack of intelligence or courage. More often, it's ego disguised as self-respect. Ego reacts quickly, vision waits, and the difference between the two quietly determines who controls the interaction and who loses momentum over time. Ego is sensitive to tone, status, and perception. It needs to be seen as capable, respected, and right. When those needs feel threatened, ego moves first and asks questions later. This is why insults sting more than facts, why being doubted can feel worse than being wrong, and why many people feel compelled to explain themselves even when no explanation is required. Ego wants immediate relief. Vision wants long-term alignment. The conflict between the two plays out in small moments that seem insignificant at the time, but accumulate into major outcomes. Consider how often people respond to provocation not to protect their goals, but to protect their image. Someone questions their decision publicly, and the instinct is to defend it immediately. Someone spreads doubt, and the impulse is to correct the record. Someone challenges authority, and the reaction is to reassert dominance. Each of these responses feels justified, even necessary, but each one accepts a frame set by someone else. The conversation becomes about perception rather than progress. Vision-led thinking operates differently. It begins with a question ego rarely asks. Does this interaction move me closer to the future I'm building? Or does it only soothe my pride in the moment? That question slows everything down. It introduces a pause where most people rush. In that pause, options appear. You can respond now, later, or not at all. You can address the issue privately instead of publicly. You can let results speak instead of words. None of these options satisfy ego, but all of them protect direction. The trade-offs are uncomfortable. When you don't respond immediately, others may misinterpret silence as weakness. When you don't defend yourself, you may feel exposed. When you choose not to correct every misunderstanding, you sacrifice being fully understood. This is the cost of vision. It requires tolerating short-term discomfort to preserve long-term leverage. Ego avoids that cost. Vision absorbs it deliberately. Real-life examples are everywhere. In professional settings, people often over-communicate to prove value. They explain decisions in excessive detail, justify priorities repeatedly, and respond to every critique. Over time, this trains others to expect access to their reasoning on demand. The moment they stop explaining, it's perceived as a problem. The cycle began not with others' entitlement, but with the ego-driven need to be validated early on. In personal life, ego shows up when someone feels the need to win every disagreement. Arguments become about being right rather than being effective. The relationship doesn't improve, but the ego feels momentarily satisfied. Later, the cost emerges as distance, tension, or erosion of trust. Vision would have asked a different question. What outcome am I actually trying to achieve here, and is this reaction aligned with that outcome? The long-term thinker understands that not every challenge is meant to be met head-on. Some are distractions designed to pull attention away from what matters. Time and energy are finite. Every minute spent defending ego is a minute not spent investing in growth. This is opportunity cost in its most personal form. The lost opportunity is rarely visible immediately, but it compounds quietly. Toxic people are skilled at exploiting ego because ego is predictable. It responds to disrespect. It seeks validation. It wants to be seen. When they provoke, they're not testing intelligence. They're testing control. If ego takes over, control shifts. The interaction becomes reactive, emotional, and short-sighted. Vision, by contrast, is harder to manipulate because it doesn't need immediate acknowledgement. It's anchored in a longer timeline. Discipline plays a central role here. Discipline is the ability to act in alignment with values rather than impulses. In moments of provocation, discipline manifests as restraint. Not silence for its own sake, but intentional silence. Not passivity, but patience. This kind of discipline is difficult because it goes against social conditioning that equates responsiveness with strength. In reality, strength often looks like choosing when and where to engage. Sacrifice is unavoidable. Choosing vision over ego means letting some things go unchallenged. It means allowing others to hold inaccurate perceptions temporarily. It means resisting the urge to correct, clarify, or compete in moments that don't matter in the long run. These sacrifices feel personal, but they protect something impersonal and larger: trajectory. Over time, the pattern becomes clear. People who are driven by ego stay busy. They're constantly managing impressions, responding to noise, and proving themselves. People who are driven by vision appear quieter. They conserve energy. They pick their moments. They let outcomes speak. The difference is not talent, but focus. Ego scatters focus across many small battles. Vision concentrates focus on a few meaningful objectives. Misplaced focus quietly destroys outcomes. When attention is divided between building something and defending oneself, building always suffers. Progress slows, momentum breaks, frustration grows. The person feels busy but not fulfilled, active but not advancing. This state often leads to burnout, not because the work is too hard, but because the effort is misdirected. Human behavior reinforces this. People respond to consistency more than explanation. When you consistently act in alignment with your goals, over time, fewer people question you. When you constantly explain yourself, you invite more questions. The paradox is that clarity increases when you speak less and do more. Ego wants to talk. Vision wants to execute. This approach doesn't guarantee approval. In fact, it often invites misunderstanding early on. But misunderstanding is temporary. Results are not. The person who tolerates being underestimated for a period often ends up controlling the narrative later, not through words, but through evidence. Choosing vision over ego is not about suppressing personality or ambition. It's about directing them. Ego wants to be fed daily. Vision is patient. It compounds quietly. And in the long run, the person who consistently chooses vision builds something that no argument could ever produce. Toxic people test consistency because inconsistency is the clearest signal that leadership is absent. This applies not only to how others lead, but to how a person leads themselves. Human behavior adjusts to patterns, not intentions. What you repeat becomes the rule. What you allow occasionally becomes the expectation. And what you enforce inconsistently becomes a suggestion rather than a standard. Most people underestimate how closely others watch these patterns, not consciously, but instinctively. Consistency is not about rigidity, it's about reliability. When your behavior changes based on mood, guilt, pressure, or fatigue, it creates uncertainty. Uncertainty invites testing. People push not because they're disrespectful by nature, but because they're trying to understand the real boundaries of the system they're operating in. If those boundaries shift, the system becomes negotiable. Negotiable systems are always exploited. This shows up early in everyday life. Someone says they don't like being contacted late at night, but they answer anyway. They tell themselves it's just this once. The message received on the other side is not the words, but the action. The action says late night access is possible. The next time it happens, the person feels more irritated because now it feels intentional. In reality, it was trained. The initial inconsistency created the condition. The irritation comes from realizing too late that the standard was never clearly enforced. In professional environments, inconsistency erodes authority faster than incompetence. A manager who enforces deadlines strictly one week and casually the next teaches their team that deadlines are flexible depending on circumstance. Over time, effort adjusts downward, not out of laziness, but out of rational response. People conserve energy when standards are unclear. When consequences are unpredictable, behavior becomes opportunistic. This is not a flaw in character, it's a feature of human behavior. The same principle applies internally. When a person commits to a routine, a goal, or a value, then abandons it under pressure, they teach themselves that their word is negotiable. Self-trust weakens. Discipline becomes conditional. Motivation starts to depend on feeling rather than decision. The long-term cost is subtle but severe. Progress slows not because the person lacks ability, but because their internal system lacks consistency. The mind stops fully committing to plans it knows might be abandoned later. Toxic people sense this immediately. They don't need evidence, they feel it. When someone enforces a boundary today and retracts it tomorrow, the message is that pressure works. When someone says no but later says yes out of guilt, the lesson is that persistence pays. The testing increases, not decreases. Each successful push reinforces the behavior, because leads to effect, and the cycle tightens. This is why kindness without consistency often backfires. People assume being generous and flexible will earn respect. Sometimes it does, but only when paired with firm standards. Without them, generosity turns into availability. Availability turns into expectation. Expectation turns into entitlement. The person giving feels increasingly drained, while the person receiving feels increasingly comfortable asking for more. Neither side fully understands how it happened, but the pattern is already established. Consistency requires sacrifice. It often means disappointing people early to avoid resenting them later. It means saying no when it would be easier to say yes and deal with the consequences afterward. It means holding the line even when exceptions feel harmless. The discomfort is immediate, but the payoff is long-term stability. Inconsistent behavior avoids short-term discomfort but accumulates long-term chaos. There's also a psychological cost to inconsistency that people rarely acknowledge. When your behavior doesn't align with your stated values, cognitive tension builds. You tell yourself you value focus, yet you allow constant interruption. You say your time matters, yet you give it away impulsively. This internal contradiction drains energy. Focus weakens not because of external pressure, but because of unresolved internal conflict. Over time, this leads to fatigue, frustration, and a sense of being out of control. Long-term thinkers understand that standards must be boring to be effective. The same response, given calmly over and over again, eventually ends negotiation. Drama keeps discussions alive. Consistency ends them. This is why effective systems rely on rules rather than moods. A rule doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It simply exists. People adapt or move on. Real-life examples are often quiet. A person who stops responding to messages during work hours every day without exception. At first, people test it. They send follow-ups. They express urgency. When the response remains unchanged, the behavior adjusts. The testing stops, not because the person became aggressive, but because the pattern became clear. Consistency removed ambiguity. In contrast, someone who responds sometimes and ignores messages other times creates confusion. Confusion invites escalation. People send more messages, call instead, or push harder. The person feels overwhelmed and misunderstood, yet the pattern they created continues to generate the same outcome. This is the hidden cost of inconsistency. It multiplies the very behavior you're trying to avoid. Misplaced focus plays a role here. When attention is divided between enforcing standards and managing reactions, enforcement weakens. People start making exceptions to avoid discomfort rather than to serve purpose. Each exception feels small, but the cumulative effect is significant. Over time, the original goal becomes harder to reach because energy is spent managing fallout instead of building forward. Consistency also protects relationships, even when it feels counterintuitive. Clear standards reduce emotional friction. When people know what to expect, they adjust without resentment. When expectations change unpredictably, tension builds. The relationship becomes about negotiation rather than connection. Consistency removes the need for constant clarification. Discipline is the mechanism that sustains consistency. Discipline is choosing the same standard even when circumstances change. It's not stubbornness. It's commitment to long-term outcomes over short-term comfort. Without discipline, values remain theoretical. With discipline, they become operational. Opportunity cost is always present. Every time you revisit a boundary you already set, you pay twice. Once in the moment and again in lost momentum. Every time you explain a standard you've already explained, you reinforce uncertainty. That time and energy could have been invested elsewhere. Over years, these small inefficiencies compound into significant losses. The uncomfortable truth is that most people don't struggle with setting boundaries. They struggle with maintaining them. Maintenance requires endurance. It requires tolerating discomfort without renegotiating. It requires trusting that consistency, though quiet, is powerful. Those who master this find that toxic behavior loses its leverage, not because people change, but because the system no longer rewards testing. Consistency turns your life into a stable structure rather than a reactive one, and stability, over time, becomes a form of authority that doesn't need to be announced or defended. Toxic people rarely disappear because they've been confronted. More often, they fade because the environment that once supported their behavior no longer exists. Environments shape behavior more powerfully than intentions or words. When conditions reward distraction, dependency, and short-term thinking, toxic dynamics thrive. When conditions reward discipline, focus, and forward movement, those same dynamics struggle to survive. This shift doesn't happen overnight, and it's rarely dramatic. It unfolds quietly as priorities change and standards rise. Growth alters context before it alters relationships. When someone begins to invest more seriously in their future, their daily structure changes. They wake up earlier. They protect blocks of time. They say no more often, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Their attention becomes more selective. Conversations become shorter and more purposeful. This isn't a personality shift. It's a reallocation of resources. Time, energy, and focus move toward what compounds rather than what entertains. Toxic people feel this change immediately, even if they can't articulate it. Access decreases, responses slow, availability shrinks. The casual interruptions that once went unnoticed now meet resistance, not through confrontation but through absence. This absence feels uncomfortable to those who relied on constant engagement, not because they were intentionally harmful, but because the relationship was built around convenience rather than alignment. Human behavior adapts to incentives. When attention was abundant, it was consumed freely. When it becomes scarce, behavior changes. Some people adjust by becoming more respectful of boundaries. Others become frustrated and accuse the person of changing. What they're really reacting to is the loss of an environment that once allowed them to offload emotional labor, seek validation, or avoid responsibility. This is where sacrifice enters the picture. Outgrowing an environment often means losing familiarity. Old routines disappear. Long-standing dynamics shift. Some connections weaken. This loss can feel personal, even when it's structural. The mind resists it, searching for ways to maintain growth without disruption. But growth without disruption is rare. Progress demands trade-offs, and one of the most common is relational comfort. Consider someone who begins to take their work seriously after years of drifting. They stop staying out late. They decline invitations that don't align with their goals. They spend weekends learning instead of socializing. The people around them may joke at first, then question, then criticize. The criticism isn't about the work itself. It's about the mirror it creates. When one person changes their trajectory, it exposes the stagnation of the environment they're leaving behind. The cause and effect chain is consistent. Increased discipline leads to tighter schedules. Tighter schedules reduce availability. Reduced availability changes relationship dynamics. Some people adapt, others resist. Resistance often takes the form of guilt, mockery, or subtle pressure to return to old patterns. These reactions are not proof that the change is wrong. They're evidence that the environment is losing its influence. Opportunity cost becomes visible here. Every hour spent maintaining outdated dynamics is an hour not invested in building something new. Every emotional negotiation drains energy that could have gone toward progress. Over time, the cumulative effect is significant. People who cling to old environments often find themselves busy but stagnant, surrounded by familiar faces but moving in circles. Long-term thinkers accept that alignment matters more than history. Shared past does not guarantee shared future. This is a difficult truth because history carries emotional weight, but decisions based solely on history ignore trajectory. Two people can walk together for years and then diverge when their directions change. Continuing together out of habit often slows both down. Toxic behavior becomes less effective as structure increases. When days are planned, there's less room for chaos. When goals are clear, distractions stand out. When standards are consistent, manipulation loses leverage. This doesn't require cutting people off abruptly. It requires building a life that doesn't leave room for dysfunction. The removal is passive, not aggressive. There's also an internal environment to consider. As discipline strengthens, tolerance for internal chaos decreases. Procrastination feels heavier. Excuses feel hollow. The same clarity applied externally begins to operate inwardly. This internal alignment reinforces external changes. A person who respects their own time finds it harder to allow others to waste it. A person committed to a long-term vision finds it uncomfortable to engage in short-term drama. Misplaced focus is exposed in this process. When priorities aren't clear, energy leaks everywhere. Conversations drag on. Commitments pile up. Progress slows. When priorities sharpen, these leaks become obvious. The cost of distraction is no longer abstract. It's measured in delayed outcomes. This awareness makes certain interactions feel expensive, not emotionally, but strategically. Some people interpret this shift as becoming cold or distant. In reality, it's becoming intentional. Warmth remains, but it's directed. Generosity continues, but it's bounded. Connection persists, but it's reciprocal. These distinctions matter. Without them, growth collapses under the weight of competing demands. The quiet power of outgrowing an environment is that it doesn't require convincing anyone. There are no speeches, no ultimatums. Behavior speaks. When actions consistently reflect a new standard, the environment responds. Some people rise, others drift. The process is gradual, but irreversible once momentum builds. There is discomfort in the middle phase. The old environment no longer fits, but the new one isn't fully formed. Loneliness can appear here, not because connection is gone, but because alignment is incomplete. This phase tests patience. Many people retreat at this point, returning to familiar dynamics for relief. Those who endure it discover that the space created by letting go is eventually filled by more compatible relationships and opportunities. Discipline sustains this transition. Discipline keeps routines intact when motivation fluctuates. It reinforces boundaries when guilt surfaces. It maintains direction when external validation is absent. Over time, discipline transforms isolation into independence and independence into confidence. Toxic people don't need to be defeated. They need an environment where their behavior no longer works. When your life becomes structured around long-term thinking, focus, and deliberate effort, that environment naturally emerges. The fading of certain relationships is not a failure of character. It's a signal of growth. And growth, by its nature, changes the room you're standing in, even if you never announce that you've moved. Here's the final truth. Toxic people don't test you to hurt you. They test you to see who's in control. Your reactions, your boundaries, your discipline, your vision. When you stop reacting emotionally, stop explaining unnecessarily, and stop giving unlimited access, you pass the test. And when you pass the test, the lesson ends. Stay patient, stay focused, delay gratification, build something so solid that chaos can't touch it. Because in the long run, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who moves quietly, thinks long term, and never lets distractions steal their future.